Or there are losses that are easy to identify, the kind that can be traced back to a moment, an event, or a decision. These are the losses that can be measured, explained, and often addressed directly. But there is another kind of loss, one that does not arrive with clarity, one that does not leave obvious evidence, yet its absence is felt deeply over time. It is the kind of loss that shows up as delay where there should be progress, as limitation where there should be flow, as effort that does not produce the expected result, even when everything appears to be in place. This is the forgotten loss, not because it never existed, but because it was never fully recognized. There are moments in life where something feels incomplete without a clear reason. A sense that more should be present, more should be working, more should be unfolding, but it remains just out of reach. Not entirely absent, but not fully accessible either. And this creates a quiet tension, because when something is clearly lost, it can be pursued directly. But when something is missing without clear definition, it becomes difficult to address. It remains in the background, influencing perception, shaping expectation, and quietly affecting outcomes without being fully understood. This is where patterns begin to form. Repeated delays that do not align with effort. Repeated limitations that do not match potential. Repeated interruptions that do not seem accidental. Individually, these may appear unrelated, but when they begin to repeat, when they form a consistent pattern over time, they point towards something deeper. Because patterns are not random. They are indicators. Indicators that something may not be aligned as it should be. Indicators that what is experienced externally may be influenced by something that has not yet been addressed internally or structurally. And this is where awareness becomes essential. Not to assume negativity, but to recognize that not everything operates on the surface level. Some forms of limitation are not immediate, they are inherited through repetition, reinforced through experience, and maintained through lack of recognition. This is why certain things feel delayed for extended periods. Not because they are impossible, but because they have not yet been fully reclaimed. Because what belongs is not always automatically accessed. Some things must be recognized before they can be restored. Some things must be acknowledged before they can be reclaimed. And without recognition, even what belongs can remain distant. This is what makes forgotten loss powerful. It is not that it cannot be recovered, it is that it has not yet been brought into focus. And what is not in focus cannot be corrected. This is why many continue to move forward with effort, trying different approaches, increasing intensity, adjusting strategies, yet still experiencing similar patterns, because the root has not been addressed. And without addressing the root, the pattern continues to reproduce itself in different forms. This creates frustration over time, because effort increases, but results do not align. Focus strengthens, but outcomes remain inconsistent. Progress feels close, but never fully established. And without understanding the underlying structure, it becomes easy to assume that more effort is the solution. But effort alone does not break hidden patterns. Recognition does. Because once something is recognized, it can be addressed. Once it is brought into awareness, it can be realigned. And once it is realigned, the pattern begins to lose its influence. This is where Psalm 66 becomes significant, not as a simple reading, but as a process that brings awareness to what has been overlooked. It shifts attention from surface level experience to deeper alignment. It creates a space where what has been hidden can be acknowledged and what has been restricted can begin to be released. Because restoration does not begin with possession, it begins with recognition, or recognition of what feels incomplete, recognition of what has been delayed, recognition of what may have been present but never fully accessed. And once recognition takes place, something changes. Focus becomes intentional. Awareness becomes deeper. Direction begins to form. This is the beginning of recovery. Not immediate, not forced, but gradual and intentional. A process where what has been overlooked is brought into clarity, and what has been restricted begins to move toward restoration. Because what is recognized can be reclaimed, and what is reclaimed no longer remains lost. This is the shift that must happen from unawareness to recognition, from recognition to alignment, from alignment to restoration. And once this process begins, the forgotten loss no longer remains hidden. It becomes something that can finally be addressed, restored, and fully integrated into the flow of life once again. Before anything can be restored, there must be alignment. Before anything can return, there must be recognition of where attention has been placed and where it needs to shift. Because restoration does not begin with external movement, it begins with internal positioning. This is where Psalm 66 establishes its foundation. It begins not with requests, not with demands, but with acknowledgement. Make a joyful noise unto God, all the earth. This is not simply an expression, it is a repositioning of focus. Because where attention is directed determines how everything else is interpreted. When attention is consumed by limitation, limitation appears larger. When attention is fixed on delay, delay feels more permanent. But when attention shifts towards something greater, something higher, something more stable, perspective begins to change. And perspective changes everything. This is the first step in realignment. Not forcing outcomes, not reacting to circumstances, but shifting awareness. Moving from a position of focusing on what is missing to a position of recognizing what is or present, but not yet fully accessed. Because acknowledgement activates awareness. It brings clarity where there was confusion. It introduces stability where there was uncertainty. It creates a foundation where direction can begin to form. This is why Psalm 66 begins this way. It establishes alignment before action. Because without alignment, action becomes scattered. Effort becomes inconsistent. Focus becomes divided. But once alignment is established, everything begins to move with greater clarity and purpose. This is how realignment starts. Not through intensity, but through direction. Because direction determines outcome more than effort alone ever can. Psalm 66 continues by reinforcing recognition of power beyond limitation. It brings attention to something constant, something stable, something not affected by temporary conditions. And this awareness creates a shift internally. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable. What once felt uncertain begins to feel guided. What once felt restricted begins to feel open. Not because circumstances have immediately changed, but because perception has shifted, and perception influences response. This is where many miss the process. They attempt to change external conditions without first changing internal alignment. They try to force results without first establishing clarity. And without clarity, effort often becomes misdirected. Psalm 66 corrects this by creating a foundation of acknowledgement first. Because acknowledgement is what connects awareness to alignment. It is what allows understanding to deepen. It is what creates space for recognition of what has been overlooked. And it is what prepares the mind to receive direction instead of reacting to confusion. This is essential for restoration, because without clear alignment, even what is being restored may not be fully recognized. Even when opportunities return, they may be misinterpreted or overlooked if internal alignment is not established. This is why realignment must come first. It ensures that when restoration begins, it is recognized. It ensures that when change occurs, it is sustained. It ensures that what returns is not lost again due to lack of awareness. Psalm 66 also introduces reflection. A movement from acknowledgement into awareness of past experience. Not to remain focused on it, but to understand it differently. To see it not as permanent loss, but as part of a process that can be realigned. Because reflection without alignment can create frustration. But reflection with alignment creates understanding. And understanding creates clarity. This clarity begins to reveal where attention has been misplaced, where patterns have formed, and where adjustments are needed. It does not create blame, it creates awareness. And awareness leads to correction. This is how alignment deepens. Not through force, but through recognition of what needs to shift. A gentle but clear repositioning of focus from what has been limiting toward what can be restored. Because what is focused on consistently becomes dominant. If focus remains on lack, lack continues to feel present. If focus remains on delay, delay continues to feel permanent. But if focus shifts toward alignment and restoration, something begins to change internally. This is the power of Psalm 66. It does not rush the process, it establishes it. It builds a foundation where attention is no longer scattered, where awareness is no longer shallow, where understanding is no longer incomplete. Instead, it creates a state of readiness, a readiness to recognize what belongs, a readiness to receive what is being restored, a readiness to move forward with clarity instead of confusion. And once this readiness is established, the process of restoration can begin to unfold naturally, because alignment creates the pathway. And once the pathway is clear, what was once delayed can begin to move forward without the same resistance. This is the role of Psalm 66 in this stage. 2. Realign focus to establish clarity and to prepare the internal structure so that restoration is not only possible but recognizable, sustainable, and complete. There are moments in life that feel like resistance, periods that feel like restriction, and seasons that seem to carry more pressure than progress. These moments are often misunderstood, not because they lack meaning, but because their purpose is not immediately clear. What feels like delay can sometimes be preparation. What feels like limitation can sometimes be refinement. And without understanding this distinction, it becomes easy to misinterpret the entire process. Psalm 66 brings clarity to this stage. For you, O God, have tested us. You have refined us as silver is refined. This statement introduces a perspective that shifts how difficulty is understood. It does not deny the existence of pressure, it explains it. Because refinement is not random. It is intentional. It is a process that removes what is unnecessary while strengthening what is essential. It does not exist to reduce value, but to reveal it. And this is what makes it difficult to recognize in the moment, because the experience of refinement often feels like loss before it feels like preparation. This is where many begin to struggle, because when something feels like it is being taken away, the natural response is resistance. When progress seems delayed, the natural reaction is frustration. When outcomes do not match effort, the immediate conclusion is often that something is wrong. But refinement operates differently. It is not always visible in its purpose while it is happening. It works beneath the surface, restructuring, adjusting, and strengthening in ways that are not immediately obvious. And without awareness, it can easily be mistaken for permanent limitation rather than temporary process. This is why understanding refinement is essential. Because misunderstanding the process can lead to misalignment. It can create impatience where patience is needed. It can create frustration where clarity is forming. It can create doubt where strength is being developed. And once these reactions take hold, they begin to interfere with the very process that is meant to bring improvement. Psalm 66 reframes this completely. It shifts focus from what is being experienced to what is being developed. It invites a deeper awareness that not every difficult moment is a sign of loss. Some are signs of preparation for something that requires greater strength, greater clarity, and greater alignment. This is the purpose of refinement: to remove what weakens stability, to strengthen what supports growth, to prepare for what requires a higher level of alignment. And this preparation is necessary, because restoration without preparation can lead to instability. If something is returned without the structure to sustain it, it can be lost again. If progress is given without the capacity to maintain it, it can collapse under pressure. This is why refinement comes before restoration. It ensures that what is being reclaimed can be sustained. But this process requires a shift in perception. Instead of seeing difficulty as permanent, it must be understood as transitional. Instead of interpreting delay as denial, it must be seen as preparation. Instead of reacting to pressure with resistance, it must be approached with awareness. This does not remove the challenge, but it changes the response to it. And response determines outcome, because when refinement is resisted, the process becomes prolonged. When it is misunderstood, alignment weakens. But when it is recognized, something changes internally. Patience becomes possible. Clarity begins to form. Focus becomes steady instead of scattered. This is where strength is developed. Not through ease, but through understanding. Because true strength is not the absence of pressure, it is the ability to remain stable within it. And stability comes from knowing that the process has or purpose even when the outcome is not yet visible. Psalm 66 reinforces this by linking testing with refinement, not punishment, not loss, but development. It creates a framework where challenges are not seen as interruptions, but as part of alignment. And this changes everything, because once the process is understood, it no longer creates the same level of confusion. It no longer leads to the same level of frustration. It becomes something that can be navigated with awareness rather than reacted to with uncertainty. This is how refinement becomes constructive instead of discouraging. It becomes a stage of preparation rather than a sign of limitation. And as this understanding deepens, something begins to shift internally. What once felt like resistance begins to feel purposeful. What once felt like delay begins to feel structured. What once felt like uncertainty begins to feel guided. This is the turning point within the process. Because once refinement is recognized for what it is, it no longer creates the same internal instability. Instead, it begins to build the very stability that is required for what comes next. And what comes next is restoration. But restoration that is stronger, more stable, and more sustainable than before. This is why the process cannot be rushed. Because what is being prepared must be able to endure. And endurance is built through refinement, not through immediate release. This is the deeper message within this stage. Not everything that feels like loss is permanent. Not everything that feels like delay is denial. Some things are being refined so that when they return, they remain. And once this is understood, the process becomes clearer, steadier, and far more meaningful than it first appeared. There comes a moment in every process where pressure reaches its peak and transition begins. A moment where what once felt like restriction starts to loosen, where what once felt delayed begins to shift, and where what seemed blocked begins to open. This moment is not random, it is the result of alignment, refinement, and preparation reaching completion. Psalm 66 reveals this turning point with clarity. We went through fire and through water, but you brought us out into a place of abundance. This is the movement from limitation into expansion. Not denial of the process, but completion of it. Not avoidance of difficulty, but emergence beyond it. Because what was experienced was not meant to define the outcome, it was meant to prepare for it. This is where many fail to recognize the shift. They remain focused on what they went through instead of what they are being brought into. They carry the memory of limitation into a moment that is designed for expansion. And because perception remains tied to the past, the present opportunity is not fully embraced. But this is where focus must change. Because transition requires recognition. What has been endured is not the final position. What has been experienced is not the final identity. The process was a path, not a destination. And once that path has served its purpose, it must be released so that movement forward can occur. This is the breakthrough, not just external but internal. Because before life changes outwardly, perception must change inwardly. If the mind remains in limitation, even abundance can feel uncertain. If expectation remains tied to delay, even progress can feel temporary. But when perception shifts, something powerful happens. Abundance becomes recognizable. This is what Psalm 66 emphasizes. It does not only describe being brought out, it defines where that movement leads, into a place of abundance. Not partial restoration, not temporary improvement, but a shift into a different condition entirely. A condition where flow replaces restriction, where access replaces limitation, where continuity replaces interruption. But this transition requires alignment. Because abundance is not only about what is available, it is about what is recognized and or received. And recognition depends on internal readiness. If readiness is not present, what is available may not be fully accessed. This is why the earlier stages were necessary. Recognition of loss created awareness. Alignment established direction. Refinement built capacity. And now, capacity must meet opportunity. This is where response becomes critical. Because when the moment of transition arrives, it must be embraced, not hesitated upon, not questioned through old patterns, but accepted with clarity and confidence. This does not mean ignoring the past attack, means not allowing it to control the present. Because holding on to past limitation while stepping into present opportunity creates conflict. And conflict weakens the ability to fully move forward. This is why release is necessary. Release of old expectations. Release of familiar patterns of thinking. Release of the belief that limitation is permanent. Because what is being entered requires a different internal structure. One that supports stability rather than survival. One that expects continuity rather than interruption. One that recognizes provision rather than anticipates lack. This is the shift into abundance, not just in external experience, but in internal alignment. And once this alignment is established, something begins to stabilize. Progress becomes more consistent. Opportunities become more visible. Outcomes begin to reflect effort more clearly, because there is no longer resistance between internal expectation and external possibility. This is where breakthrough becomes sustainable. Not a temporary moment, but a new pattern. Because once limitation is broken and alignment is maintained, repetition begins to work in a new direction. Instead of repeating cycles of delay, it begins to reinforce cycles of progress. And this is what makes the transition powerful. It is not only about reaching a new place, it is about remaining there. Because abundance without stability can be temporary, but abundance, or with alignment, becomes consistent. This is why the process must be completed fully. Recognition, alignment, refinement, and now transition. Each stage builds upon the previous one, ensuring that what is entered is not only reached but sustained. This is the deeper meaning of being brought out into abundance. Not escape from difficulty, but arrive into stability. Not temporary relief, but structured flow. Not a moment of change, but a new condition of living. And once this condition is embraced, something becomes clear. What once felt restricted no longer holds the same power. What once felt delayed no longer defines direction. What once felt uncertain no longer controls expectation, because the transition has occurred. And with it, a new pattern begins, one that reflects alignment, stability, and continuous movement forward without the same limitations that once existed. There is a reason why short, intentional periods of focused alignment can produce powerful results. Not because time itself holds power, but because undivided attention does. When focus is sustained without interruption, it begins to shape internal patterns more quickly, more deeply, and more effectively than scattered effort over long periods. This is the purpose behind the 3 days. It is not about duration, it is about intensity of alignment. A deliberate decision to remove distraction, to concentrate awareness, and to repeat a single direction of focus until it begins to take root internally. Because what is focused on consistently becomes dominant, and what becomes dominant internally begins to influence everything externally. This is why consistency over these 3 days matters. Not partial attention, not occasional reflection, but full engagement. A period where attention is not divided between multiple directions, where thought is not scattered across different concerns, but centered on one clear intention: restoration and alignment. Because scattered focus weakens impact. When attention moves in multiple directions, it reduces depth. It prevents internal patterns from fully forming. It interrupts the process before it has the opportunity to stabilize. And as a result, even meaningful effort may not produce lasting change. But when focus is sustained, something different happens. Clarity begins to deepen. Awareness becomes sharper. Internal alignment starts to strengthen. And over time, even within a short, consistent period, this alignment begins to form a new internal structure. This is why repetition within these 3 days is essential. Each repetition reinforces direction. Each moment of focus strengthens awareness. Each return to alignment builds continuity. And continuity is what creates momentum. Because once momentum begins, it becomes easier to maintain direction. It becomes easier to stay aligned. It becomes easier to recognize shifts that were not visible before. This is how internal change accelerates, not through force, but through uninterrupted focus. During these 3 days, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. Old patterns start to weaken, not because they are being forcefully removed, but because they are no longer being reinforced. Attention is no longer feeding them. Awareness is no longer aligned with them. And without reinforcement, patterns lose strength over time. At the same time, new patterns begin to form. Patterns of clarity, patterns of stability, patterns of expectation aligned with restoration rather than limitation. And as these new patterns strengthen, they begin to replace the old ones. This is the process of reconditioning. Not immediate, not forced, but gradual and consistent. And within a focus period like 3 days, this process becomes more noticeable because there is less interruption, less distraction, less shifting of attention, less fragmentation of thought. And this allows alignment to deepen more quickly. But this requires discipline, not rigid control, but intentional commitment. Stacks or willingness to remain focused even when distractions arise. A decision to return to alignment repeatedly, even when the mind attempts to move in different directions. Because the mind is naturally conditioned by past patterns. It may try to return to familiar thoughts. It may attempt to revisit old expectations. It may bring up previous limitations as reference points. But this is where consistency becomes powerful. Each time attention is redirected, the new pattern is strengthened. Each time focus is maintained, alignment becomes deeper. And each time repetition continues, the internal structure becomes more stable. This is how change becomes established. Not in a single moment, but in a series of consistent moments that build upon each other. And by the end of these 3 days, something begins to shift. Not always dramatically, but noticeably. Clarity becomes more consistent. Awareness becomes more grounded. Expectation begins to align with restoration rather than repetition of delay. This is the beginning of transformation. Because once internal alignment changes, external experience begins to follow over time. But the key is not only the 3 days, it is what those 3 days establish. They create a foundation, a starting point for continued alignment, a structure that can be maintained beyond the initial period. Because what is built in focus can be sustained through continued consistency. This is why these 3 days must be approached with intention, not as a temporary exercise, but as a concentrated effort to establish a new internal direction. A direction that does not fade once the period ends, but continues to guide thinking, perception, and response moving forward. Because once a new pattern is strong enough, it begins to sustain itself. And when it sustains itself, it becomes part of identity. This is the true power of consistent focus, turning short periods of intentional alignment into long-term transformation. There comes a moment when everything, or that has been understood, everything that has been revealed, and everything that has been processed internally must move into action. Because awareness without action remains incomplete. Understanding without response does not create change. And recognition without alignment does not produce restoration. This is that moment. Not a moment to delay, not a moment to question, but a moment to decide. Because what has been revealed about loss, alignment, refinement, and restoration is not meant to remain theoretical. It is meant to be applied intentionally. The process is clear. Recognition has already begun. Alignment has already been introduced. Refinement has already been understood. The pathway to restoration has already been established. Now, response is required. This is where many hesitate. They understand the process, but they delay the action. They recognize what needs to be done, but they postpone the commitment. And in that delay, the same patterns that were identified begin to remain active, simply because they have not yet been replaced. But cycles do not break through delay. They break through decision. A clear, intentional, consistent decision to move in a different direction. A decision that does not depend on mood, convenience, or temporary motivation, but one that is rooted in clarity and commitment. This is the call. To take these 3 days seriously, not as a suggestion, but as a structured opportunity. A defined period where focus is not divided, where alignment is not optional, and where consistency is not interrupted. Because what is done in these 3 days sets a foundation that can either be strengthened or weakened, depending on the level of commitment. And this foundation determines how effectively restoration begins to take place. This is why intentionality matters. Not passive engagement, but active participation. Not casual reading, but focused alignment. Not occasional reflection, but continuous awareness throughout the process. Because what is engaged with deeply produces deeper results. And during these 3 days, attention must remain clear. Clear on what is being restored. Clear on what is being released. Clear on what is being released. Because clarity directs focus, and focus determines outcome. Do not allow distraction to break the process. Distraction may come through routine, through overthinking, through returning to old patterns of thought. But each time distraction appears, it must be replaced with intention. Because every moment of redirected focus strengthens the new pattern that is being formed. This is how consistency is built. Not by avoiding distraction completely, but by refusing to remain in it. A constant return to alignment. A repeated decision to stay focused on restoration, rather than drifting back into limitation. This is where discipline becomes powerful. Not as restriction, but as protection of the process. Because what is being built requires attention. It requires continuity. It requires repetition. It requires commitment. And without these, even the clearest process can remain incomplete. But with them, something begins to shift. Not only internally, but externally over time. Because once internal alignment becomes strong, external conditions begin to follow. Opportunities begin to align differently. Progress begins to move with less resistance. Outcomes begin to reflect effort more clearly. This is the beginning of reclaiming. Not forced, not rushed, but aligned. And as alignment continues beyond these 3 days, restoration begins to stabilize. What is reclaimed does not feel temporary. What is restored does not feel fragile. It becomes part of a new structure that supports continuity instead of repetition of past patterns. This is the goal, not a temporary breakthrough, but a lasting shift. And that shift begins with this decision to commit fully,